Most people in the Middle Ages never traveled. Their world was their village. It was the fields they worked, the church they attended, and the market a few miles away. For them, the horizon was the edge of the world. Leaving was not a casual decision. It was a serious, often dangerous undertaking. So, why did anyone bother? There were a few big reasons. The most powerful one was faith. Religion was woven into every part of life, and for a devout person, a pilgrimage was a profound act. It was a journey to a holy place to see a saint's bones or a piece of the true cross. People went to ask for a miracle, like healing from a sickness. They went to do penance for their sins, hoping to shorten their time in purgatory. Or they went simply to be closer to God. The destinations were famous: Canterbury in England, Rome in Italy, Santiago de Compostela in Spain, and the ultimate destination, Jerusalem. A pilgrim would walk for weeks, months, even years. They wore a special hat and carried a staff. They were often given food and shelter along the way, but the journey itself was a prayer, a long, hard test of their devotion. Then there was money. Merchants were the great travelers of the medieval world. They moved goods from where they were made to where they were wanted. English wool went to Flanders to be woven into cloth. French wine went to England. Spices, silk, and other luxuries came from the East, passing through many hands to reach the castles of Europe. A merchant's life was a cycle of risk and reward. They had to navigate treacherous seas, bandit-infested roads, and a confusing web of tolls and taxes. They traveled to big trade fairs like the ones in Champagne, France, where people from all over Europe gathered to buy and sell. These journeys created networks, spread ideas, and slowly connected the isolated corners of the world. The war was another powerful reason to move. A king or a great lord would summon his knights and foot soldiers. His armies were constantly on the move. They marched to defend a border, to put down a rebellion, or to invade a neighbor's land. The Crusades were the largest military movements of the age. Tens of thousands of people, from knights to peasants, traveled across Europe to the Holy Land. For a soldier, travel was not about seeing the world. It was about hard marching, poor food, and the constant threat of battle. Their lives were governed by the orders of their commander. Some people traveled because it was their job. Messengers carried letters between kings and popes. They rode hard, changing horses at relay stations to deliver news as quickly as possible. Diplomats and envoys journeyed to other courts to negotiate treaties or arrange royal marriages. The king's court itself was often mobile. A monarch might travel around his kingdom to show his authority, collect taxes, and administer justice. This meant his entire household, hundreds of people, had to pack up and move constantly. Scribes, cooks, priests, and nobles were all part of this traveling circus. And finally, some people traveled out of desperation or ambition. A young man might leave his village to become an apprentice in a city. Students walked hundreds of miles to attend the new universities in Paris, Oxford, or Bologna. And when famine or plague struck, people fled their homes hoping to find a place that was safer or had more food. They traveled not toward a grand destination, but away from a disaster. For all these people, leaving home was a leap into the unknown. It meant trading the familiar for a world of uncertainty. The idea of a smooth paved road with clear signs is a modern one. A medieval road was often just a wide, muddy track. It followed the lay of the land, winding around hills and through forests. Old Roman roads still existed in some places, but they were often in terrible shape. The stones were broken or had been stolen for buildings. After a heavy rain, a road could turn into a swamp. A wagon's wheels would sink up to their axles in the mud. Progress would slow to a crawl. In winter, snow could make mountain passes impossible to cross. There were no maps for the average person. You found your way by following landmarks, like a certain river or a distant hill, or you asked for directions from people you met. For most people, travel meant walking. It was the only option they had. A person in good health could walk about 20 miles in a day. You would start at sunrise and stop at sunset. You carried everything you owned on your back: a little food, a water skin, a spare tunic, maybe a blanket. Your shoes were simple leather-turned shoes, which wore out quickly. Walking for weeks on end was exhausting. Your feet would be covered in blisters. Your muscles would ache. You were exposed to the sun, the rain, and the wind. It was the slowest way to travel, but it was how the vast majority of people, from pilgrims to peasants, got from one place to another. If you had money, you could travel on horseback. This was much faster and more comfortable than walking. A rider could cover 30 or 40 miles a day, but a horse was a huge expense. You had to buy it, feed it, and care for it. Different horses were used for different purposes. A knight rode a powerful war horse called a destrier into battle. For long-distance travel, a smoother gaited horse, like a palfrey, was preferred. Goods and baggage were carried by pack horses or sumpter horses. Owning a horse was a clear sign of status. It meant you were a person of some importance, not a common laborer. Goods were usually moved by cart or wagon. These were heavy, 2- or 4-wheeled vehicles pulled by oxen or horses. Oxen were slow but strong and steady. Horses were faster but required more care. Carts did not have suspension. The ride was incredibly bumpy. They were really only practical for moving cargo, not people, and they were slaves to the condition of the roads. A deep rut or a patch of thick mud could stop a wagon in its tracks. The driver would have to unload the cargo, pull the wagon free, and then load it all up again. People did not travel alone if they could help it. It was too dangerous. They formed groups for mutual protection. Merchants would travel in long caravans with hired guards. Pilgrims would band together, sharing stories and prayers to pass the time. A wealthy noble or church official traveled with a large retinue. This included servants, clerks, armed guards, and wagons full of supplies. It was a slow-moving, self-sufficient community on the road. Traveling in a group made you a harder target for robbers. It also meant there were people to help if you got sick or if a cart broke down. The journey was a shared experience, a common struggle against the hardships of the road. The medieval world was not a safe place, and travel amplified all its dangers. The most immediate fear for many travelers was robbery. The roads were not policed. Dense forests and remote hills were perfect hiding places for bandits and outlaws. These were often desperate men, former soldiers with no war to fight, or peasants who had lost their land. They would ambush travelers, especially those who looked like they had money. A merchant caravan was a tempting target. That's why they hired armed guards. But even a poor pilgrim was not safe. They might be robbed of the few coins they had, their food, or even their clothes. To be left with nothing in the middle of nowhere was a terrifying prospect. The law was local and often brutal. When you crossed from one lord's land to another, the rules could change completely. What was legal in one village might be a crime in the next. Travelers were outsiders, and outsiders were often viewed with suspicion. You could be accused of a crime you didn't commit with no one to speak for you. There was no guarantee of a fair trial. A lord might see a wealthy traveler as an easy source of revenue. He could trump up a charge and seize your goods. Justice was not consistent. It depended entirely on the whims of the local power. Nature itself was a constant enemy. Bad weather could ruin a journey. A week of solid rain could make roads impassable. Rivers would flood, washing away bridges and fords. In the mountains, a sudden snowstorm could trap travelers for days, with their food running out. At sea, a storm could rip a ship's sails and smash it against the rocks. Even in good weather, the landscape presented challenges. There were mountains to climb, forests to navigate, and rivers to cross. A simple injury, like a twisted ankle, could be a disaster. With no doctors or modern medicine, a broken leg could easily become infected. A serious illness on the road was often a death sentence. Wild animals were another real threat. The forests of medieval Europe were much larger and wilder than they are today. They were home to wolves and bears. A person traveling alone at dusk was vulnerable. Wolves were especially feared. They moved in packs and were known to attack livestock and, sometimes, people. Travelers would build a large fire at night to keep them away. The sounds of the forest at night, full of unfamiliar noises, would have been deeply unsettling for someone used to the safety of a village. Getting lost was incredibly easy. With no reliable maps or signposts, a traveler relied on memory, local knowledge, and the sun. A wrong turn could lead you miles out of your way into dangerous or uninhabited territory. You could run out of food and water. Language was another barrier. A merchant from Italy traveling in Germany would not be able to speak the local dialect. He would have to rely on gestures or hope to find a priest or another educated person who knew Latin, the common language of the church. Every interaction, from buying food to asking for directions, was a challenge. All these difficulties, big and small, made every journey a test of endurance and luck. Every traveler who reached their destination had a story to tell. After a long day of walking or riding, finding a safe place to spend the night was the top priority. The options varied a lot depending on who you were and how much money you had. For most ordinary travelers, the destination was an inn or a tavern. But these were nothing like a modern hotel. A typical inn was a noisy, crowded, and often dirty place. The main feature was a large common room with a fireplace. This was where everyone ate, drank, and socialized. The air would be thick with smoke from the fire and the smell of sweat, stale ale, and unwashed bodies. You didn't get your own private room. That was a luxury reserved for the very wealthy. Most people slept in a shared space. If you were lucky, you might get a spot in a large bed with 2 or 3 other strangers. You would sleep in your clothes for warmth and to prevent them from being stolen. If the beds were full or if you couldn't afford one, you paid for a spot on the floor. You would find a space in the rushes near the fire, wrap yourself in your cloak, and hope for the best. Theft was common. You had to keep a close eye on your belongings. The food at an inn was simple and basic. The main dish was usually a pottage, a thick stew of grains and whatever vegetables were available. It was cooked in a large cauldron that hung over the fire all day. Ingredients were constantly added, so you never knew exactly what you were eating. You might also get coarse bread and cheese. The main drink was ale or beer. Water was often unsafe to drink, so ale was the standard for everyone, including children. It was weak by modern standards, but it was calories and hydration in one. The quality of inns varied greatly. Some on major trade routes were well-run establishments. Others were little more than rough shacks run by dishonest innkeepers who would water down the ale and overcharge strangers. For pilgrims, a better option was often a monastery. The rule of St. Benedict required monasteries to offer hospitality to travelers, especially the poor and pilgrims. This was seen as a Christian duty. Monasteries were usually located in more remote areas, providing a refuge from the chaos of the road. The accommodation was simple but clean. You might get a small private cell with a straw mattress. The food was also simple, but it was often better and more reliable than what you'd find at an inn. The monks and nuns offered not just physical comfort, but spiritual comfort as well. A traveler could attend services in the monastery's church and find a moment of peace. Along major pilgrimage routes, special guest houses called hospices were set up. These were run by religious orders specifically to care for travelers. They provided free food and lodging for a night or two. They also cared for the sick and the poor. For a pilgrim with little money, these institutions were a lifeline. If you were a merchant or a noble, you would try to avoid public inns altogether. You would rely on a network of personal connections. You might stay with a business associate in another town or at another nobleman's castle. Hospitality was a key part of the social code for the upper classes. A host was expected to provide his guests with the best food and entertainment he could afford. This was a way of showing off his wealth and status. For the traveler, it was a safe, comfortable, and free place to stay. But for the vast majority of people on the road, the night was a choice between a crowded, noisy inn, the quiet charity of a monastery, or, if all else failed, the cold, hard ground under the stars. Land travel was hard, but sometimes it wasn't an option. Rivers and seas were major barriers, but they were also major highways. For moving heavy, bulky goods, traveling by water was often much more efficient than using a wagon. In rivers like the Rhine, the Seine, and the Thames were full of barges. These were flat-bottomed boats, poled or sailed, that moved slowly but could carry a huge amount of cargo. It was a cheap way to transport things like grain, wine, and stone. Sea travel was a different matter. It was faster than land travel for long distances, but it was also far more dangerous. The ships of the early Middle Ages were small, open boats. By the later Middle Ages, they had developed larger ships like the cog, a single-masted ship with high sides, which was common in the rough waters of the Atlantic and North Sea. In the Mediterranean, oar-powered galleys were still used, especially for warfare. Life on a medieval ship was miserable. There were no cabins for passengers. You found a space on the open deck among the cargo, the sailors, and the animals. There was no shelter from the sun or the rain. The ship was incredibly crowded and filthy. There were no toilets. People just relieved themselves over the side. The stench would have been overwhelming. So food was basic hard biscuits, salted meat or fish, and stale water or ale. Seasickness was a constant problem. But the real fear was the sea itself. Storms could appear with little warning. A ship could be swamped by huge waves, or have its mast snapped by the wind. If the ship went down, your chances of survival were almost zero. Most people could not swim, and there were no lifeboats. Pirates were another threat. The waters of the Mediterranean and the English Channel were infested with them. They would attack merchant ships, stealing the cargo and either killing the crew or selling them into slavery. Because of these dangers, ships tried to stay within sight of the coast whenever possible. They would sail only during the day and anchor in a safe harbor at night. This made the journey longer, but it was much safer than venturing into the open ocean. Even on land, crossing borders presented a unique set of challenges. Europe was not a continent of large, unified nations. It was a patchwork of small kingdoms, duchies, and counties, each ruled by a different lord. and every lord wanted to make money from the people passing through his territory. This meant tolls. There were tolls to cross a bridge. There were tolls to use a certain road. There were tolls to enter a town through its gates. A merchant might have to pay a dozen different tolls on a single journey. You had to carry a variety of different coins, because a coin from one region might not be accepted in another. Money changers did good business in market towns, but they often cheated travelers who didn't know the local exchange rates. The language was a constant barrier. Latin was the language of the church and educated people, but the common person spoke a local dialect. The dialect in one valley could be almost unintelligible to someone from 100 miles away. As communication was a struggle, you had to rely on simple gestures or hope to find someone who could act as an interpreter. Every part of a medieval journey, from the first step to the last, was filled with uncertainty. It required courage, endurance, and a great deal of luck. Travel stripped away the familiar comforts of home and forced people to confront a world that was often hostile and unforgiving. It was an experience that was reserved for the desperate, the devout, and the daring.